Hi, so today we're going to talk about what happens when errors occur during the process of transcription and translation or mutations to your DNA. And what is the end result of that? We've talked about mutations before when we talked about non-disjunction in our karyotypes. And those were mutations where you were either lacking a chromosome or have an extra chromosome. So these were large mutations. There can also be small mutations at the base level that can also have profound effects, quite significant effects as well, because when you mess up the order of your bases in your DNA, that then affects the protein that is produced. And if that protein isn't produced properly, it can change the structure of your body as it develops. So first of all, we need to know what exactly is a mutation. So a mutation is defined as any change in the DNA, whether good, bad, or neutral. So sometimes there's mutations in what we call our junk DNA that doesn't affect us at all. It's still a mutation that occurred, but there's just nothing that it's affecting. Sometimes there's good mutations that actually helps organisms better adapt to their environment, though those are actually incredibly rare. It's like winning the lottery. Most mutations, besides having no effect, have a bad effect on the organism. When you mess with the instructions, as we saw in non-disjunction, it's typically not a good thing. So on this page, I put these two pictures. One is not reality and one is reality. So they like to show on TV that if you have mutations, it turns you into like a superhero and gives you special powers. And that's really not the case, okay? When you change your DNA, you're not going to turn into a Ninja Turtle. Instead, you might turn into a turtle with two heads if you have the mutation in a gene called a Hox gene that controls where your body parts go during development. So what exactly happens to our DNA when we have a mutation? So remember that your DNA is full of bonds, and between the bases are these weak hydrogen bonds. They're weak so that you can open your DNA and make copies of it. The problem is, because they're weak, they're also likely to be damaged when you have an input of energy or chemicals that do not belong in your body. The sides of your DNA very rarely have mutations, though it can occur because those are covalent bonds and they're stronger. But again, with more exposure, you're more likely to break some of those bonds too. So more often what happens is these hydrogen bonds break and or change of their own accord with this incoming energy. So this is UV light, like from the sun. So if you go out and you sunbathe too much, you could potentially alter your DNA, and that would mess with some of your bonds in here, and then these lose their partners, and your DNA basically gets all wonky. And what this would do is then change the order of the bases as you copy your DNA, or make it so you can't. And what typically this turns out to be is something like skin cancer. So mutations are caused by spontaneous mistakes during replication when you're copying your DNA. They do occur. They typically are fairly rare. And again, you have proofreading capabilities with your enzymes, but these mistakes do accumulate over time. And the more you expose yourself to things called mutagens are things that influence mutations, the more likely you are going to have these small changes to your DNA turn into something that's a much bigger issue. So things that are mutagens are radiation. Radiation can come in a lot of forms. It could be radiation that is from the sun, and you could also have radiation that is from like toxic waste. Okay, strong chemicals. So if you work in a job where you're surrounded by strong chemicals, you have a higher instance of mutations potentially if you don't protect yourself, and that can alter your DNA and lead to things like cancer. And then very high temperatures can also denature some of the proteins and alter those bonds. And so if you're exposed to very high temperatures, not just like a really warm day, but really high temperatures like from industry, it can do that. But usually you're going to have some other health effects from that besides the mutations. So mutations in body cells, you become ill usually when that occurs, and a lot of times it leads to some kind of cancer. So we have two main categories of mutations when we're talking about at the base level. One is worse than the other. So if you look at a frame shift mutation, this is the one that is far worse. And the name kind of tells you what it lands up doing. It lands up shifting your code. Like you have a little frame around 3 letters at a time, because that's how we read our DNA code. And that will just shift because one was either added or deleted. So you either added a base or you deleted a base. And why this is so bad is because it alters the whole sequence after that frame shift happens. Everything is messed up. And so by altering the whole sequence after the fact, that means that the protein that is made from that sequence is not going to be anywhere near normal, all right, because it affects a whole bunch of them. And then we have the point mutation. A point mutation, as its name says, it only changes at one single point. So it's going to change one letter. Let's say if you had, let's do an example here. If you had AAA, it's hard to write on this thing, so bear with me. Let's say that was your triplet code in your DNA, okay? And normally, AAA would bind, A binds with U's in mRNA. So in your mRNA, you would have UUU, which would give you one of your amino acids. I'd have to look at the chart. So instead, if something happens, you have a mutation, and let's say this first A is turned into a G instead. All right, there was a mistake that happened, and now it's a G. Well, that's going to change that U from a U into a C. And those 3 letters most likely are not going to give you the same amino acid, but it's just going to be one of the amino acids that will be messed up. Versus if we have a frame shift, all right, a frame shift, let's do a code we'll start with AAA again, and let's keep it simple. So we got AAA, let's do CCC, and then GGG. Okay, G, G, G. Okay, so if we flip that code, then we would have an mRNA, we'd have UUU, which would give me an amino acid. In this case, I would have GGG. My G's look terrible. All right, and C, C, C. But let's say I add a letter. So what letter I'm going to add? Let's say right in here I had a mutation, and let's add a T. All right, a T got added in there. So if a T got added in there, I'm going to read my code differently. All right, I'm going to read my code as ATA, then ACC, CGG, and I'm going to have a leftover one hanging out at the end that can't do anything. So if I flip my code this time, like my new code, I would have U, and then T goes to A, U, and then I would start with an A here, so then I would have U, G, G, and I would start with a C over here, so it would be G, C, C, and then I have a lonely C hanging at the end that's not going to do anything. So every single codon is messed up after that insertion. And the same thing happens with a deletion. If I just deleted this A, and forget about the T, you would start with AAC, CCG, and then you have 2 left over that couldn't do anything. So you can see how messed up a really long strand of DNA could get if you are having frame shift mutations, okay? So this little frog down here, if you look at him, you can notice the number of legs. He's got 1, 2, 3, one's up there, one's back there. He's got a bunch of extra legs, so just like our turtle over there, he had a mutation in a Hox gene, which was just a point mutation, just changed one single base, and it had this effect on this organism. So here's some examples just to show you of point mutations that can have significant effects. So a point mutation in this disorder, progeria, and you may have seen these kids on TV. They look like little old people, but they're not. These are actually little kids. They're like, 10, 11, 12 years old, little kids, and they look like little old people. And so they have a mutation in their DNA for a protein That has to do with their ability to lay down layers of fat under the skin, and so it does it incorrectly. And so because of this mutation, they tend to be smaller than normal. They tend to be bald, okay, they can't grow hair, and they look older because they don't have this layer under the skin that we tend to lose as we age, all the cartilage and everything. They can't retain their fat, so they're always very, very thin, which leads to that aging look as well. So it causes also your cells to die very quickly. So it's called apoptosis. Apoptosis kills cells, and that happens much faster in these guys. That's also why their cells have to reproduce, and they age more quickly, because that's what's happening to us when our cells reproduce. They are aging us. So with this, they get stiff joints, they get hardened arteries, and so they tend to have heart attacks and strokes as young teenagers, and it shortens their lifespan significantly. And so one little letter that's off in a certain gene, and it can cause these kind of effects. So here's again to show you kind of what I was doing with my letters earlier, what an insertion and a deletion looks like in a frame shift. So here's your regular code in mRNA, and those are the amino acids you normally get. And in this case, we simply added the letter A. There was a mutation that added a base that should not be there, and so it shifted the code down. So this amino acid is wrong. Let me get this highlighter. All right, this amino acid is wrong, and then this one, and if there were any after that, they would also be incorrect. And then when a deletion occurs, so you should have had this C was deleted, so all the G's shifted this way. And so now what we end up coding for in this instance is actually told it to stop coding. And again, this protein is not going to be anywhere near what it should be at that point. Sickle cell anemia is also a point mutation. It's actually a fairly common point mutation, and especially in people of African American descent. And the only reason it shows up in people of African American descent is the original mutation occurred in that ethnic group, and they tend in the past to marry each other, and it propagated throughout their ethnicity. Other ethnic groups tend to have other genetic disorders, and then as we become more and more interbred with different ethnicities, because we're all humans, then you don't see them isolated to certain groups anymore. But this is the gene over here. This is the gene in your, triplet code in your gene that codes for this mRNA code, right? A codon that codes for this amino acid to make normal hemoglobin in your red blood cells. Well, if you have sickle cell, you have a mutation in one single base, which changes the base in your mRNA, which changes the base in your hemoglobin. And so this ends up altering the shape of your red blood cells. Not all the time, just when your body is under stress, and it has profound effects. And so this is what happens to your red blood cells. They go from a nice round, you can look at the background, nice round blood cell that's going to flow nicely through your veins and arteries and capillaries to this sickle shape. And this sickle shape tends to not flow well and actually clumps up and causes blood clots with other blood cells. And what happens then is it blocks the blood from flowing through your extremities, especially, and it's very, very painful. They call it a pain crisis. And so somebody with sickle cell anemia, when they're going through one of these crises, you have to go to the hospital to be supported. They have to give you medicine. They have to make sure that the blood clots are not occurring in your brain, or you're going to lose a limb or anything like that. And if you have good medical care treatment, you can live with sickle cell anemia. It's just a much harder life. All right, so that's them normally flowing, and then when they're sickle cell, you can see kind of how they start blocking up in there, causing clots. So an example of a frame shift would be Tay-Sachs disease. Tay-Sachs is really awful. It's a disease of the nervous system. So babies are born normal, and when they have Tay-Sachs, it alters one of their proteins, and it builds up this fatty tissue in their brain. And as that builds up, the babies become more and more mentally handicapped over time until they eventually die, usually pretty young, between 3 and 5 years old. And this is a shift, a significant shift. So here's your normal DNA. Let me get my thing. Here's your normal DNA up here. All right, and then you get this insertion of the code, right? And everything shifts down, and that changes all these amino acids so that those proteins are not made properly. And the reason why this picture is right here is one of the early signs of Tay-Sachs is to have this bullseye type shape in your eye. So you know how doctors shine lights in your eyes to look at your eyes? Sometimes they're looking for little evidences like this to see what's going on, even in young babies. This particular mutation tends to be most common in people of Jewish descent. Again, it doesn't really have anything to do with the religion, just the fact that that mutation originally occurred within that group of people, and people of that religion tend to marry other people of that religion, and so it perpetuated through that group, and as we marry other people, that changes.